One of the most common patterns many chosen ones eventually recognize in their lives is the strange order in which people respond to them. Respect rarely arrives first. Instead, the first reaction is often confusion, suspicion, or misunderstanding. People form quick opinions about you long before they understand who you actually are. They may describe you as quiet, intense, distant, arrogant, or difficult to read. Some might even assume that your silence hides something negative. Others interpret your boundaries as coldness or pride. At first, these reactions can feel unfair, especially if your intentions toward others are honest and respectful. You may find yourself wondering why simply being yourself seems to create such strong reactions in environments where you were only trying to exist peacefully. But for many chosen ones, this pattern repeats often enough that it becomes impossible to ignore. People misunderstand you first, and only later, sometimes much later, do they begin respecting you. The important realization is that this sequence is not accidental. It is part of a process that unfolds when someone moves through the world with a different kind of awareness and discipline. The misunderstanding occurs because you do not follow the familiar social scripts that most environments expect. In many social situations, people quickly evaluate each other through recognizable behaviors. They trust individuals who perform enthusiasm in predictable ways, who participate easily in group conversations, and who respond to every situation with visible emotional reactions. These behaviors create a sense of familiarity that helps others categorize who you are within seconds. But chosen ones often operate differently. Instead of performing personality traits to gain approval, you observe first. You listen more than you speak. You reveal your thoughts selectively rather than constantly explaining yourself.
These habits create a presence that is harder for people to interpret immediately. When others cannot categorize you quickly, they often fill the uncertainty with assumptions. This is how misunderstanding begins. Your quietness becomes arrogance. Your focus becomes intensity. Your boundaries become distance. The human mind tends to simplify what it cannot easily understand. Rather than admitting that they need more time to understand you, people sometimes attach labels that make your behavior easier to explain within their existing expectations. These labels do not necessarily reflect the truth of your character. They reflect the discomfort of encountering someone who does not behave according to the usual script. Understanding this dynamic can change the way chosen ones interpret the early reactions they receive from others. Instead of viewing misunderstanding as a personal failure, you begin seeing it as evidence that your presence does not fit easily into the patterns people are accustomed to. In many cases, misunderstanding is simply an admission that the observer cannot categorize you yet. They do not know which box to place you in, so they temporarily choose the label that feels most convenient. Over time, however, something else begins happening. As people continue observing your behavior, the initial labels begin losing their credibility. They notice that the person they once called arrogant never actually behaves with arrogance. They see that the individual they described as distant consistently shows integrity and reliability. The behavior that once looked unusual begins making sense when viewed across a longer period of time. This is where the shift from misunderstanding to respect begins. Respect grows through observation rather than first impressions. While misunderstanding arrives quickly because it relies on assumptions, respect takes time because it requires evidence. People need to see that your character remains consistent, even when circumstances change. They need to observe how you respond under pressure, how you treat others when there is nothing to gain, and whether your values remain stable over time. As those observations accumulate, the narrative people created during their first impression begins collapsing. The same traits they once criticized start appearing admirable when viewed through the lens of consistency. Silence becomes wisdom. Discipline becomes strength. Boundaries become self-respect. The chosen one eventually realizes that the early season of misunderstanding often serves an important purpose. It filters out people who only respond to surface-level impressions. Those who rely entirely on quick judgments often move on before they have the patience to understand you fully. Meanwhile, individuals who observe more carefully begin recognizing the depth behind your behavior. The process may feel uncomfortable at first, but it also ensures that the respect you eventually receive is genuine rather than superficial. Once this pattern becomes clear, another question naturally arises. Why exactly do chosen ones trigger this early misunderstanding so often in the first place? What is it about their behavior that makes people misinterpret them before they are eventually respected? Once a chosen one begins noticing the pattern of being misunderstood before being respected, the next step is understanding why that reaction appears so frequently. The reason is rarely hostility or bad intentions from others. More often, the misunderstanding comes from the way chosen ones move through social environments differently than most people expect. 3 specific behaviors tend to trigger that reaction. You do not perform for approval, you do not over-explain yourself, and you do not automatically blend into group energy.
Each of these behaviors challenges the unspoken rules that many social groups rely on to maintain comfort and predictability. The first reason people misunderstand chosen ones is simple but powerful. You do not perform for approval. In many environments, people learn early that acceptance often depends on certain forms of social performance. They exaggerate enthusiasm in conversations, laugh at jokes they do not find funny, and mirror the emotional tone of the group even when they do not genuinely feel the same way. These behaviors are rarely malicious. They are simply habits people develop to maintain harmony and avoid conflict. But chosen ones often struggle with this type of performance. Instead of pretending enthusiasm to gain approval, you prefer authenticity. If something does not genuinely interest you, you remain quiet rather than forcing excitement. If a conversation feels dishonest or shallow, you listen politely without adding energy to it. This honesty can be interpreted incorrectly by people who are accustomed to social performance. When someone refuses to act out the expected script, the group may assume the person is being rude, distant, or arrogant. In reality, you are simply choosing integrity over approval. But because many people are used to evaluating sincerity through visible performance, your authenticity becomes difficult for them to interpret at first. The second reason misunderstanding appears is that chosen ones rarely feel the need to explain themselves constantly. In many social situations, people defend their intentions quickly whenever they sense disagreement or criticism. They explain their decisions in detail, clarify their motivations repeatedly, and attempt to correct every misunderstanding as soon as it appears. Chosen ones often operate differently. Instead of engaging in constant explanation, you allow your behavior to speak for itself over time. When rumors appear or someone questions your motives, you may choose silence, rather than entering an argument designed to satisfy everyone's curiosity. From your perspective, explaining yourself to every observer feels unnecessary and exhausting. But from the outside, this silence can be misinterpreted. People sometimes assume that a person who refuses to defend themselves must be hiding something. Others believe the silence signals arrogance or superiority. They may think you consider yourself above responding to criticism. In reality, the decision not to over-explain often comes from a different understanding of how truth works. Chosen ones recognize that character reveals itself through consistent behavior over time. A single explanation cannot compete with the clarity that long-term consistency eventually provides. Instead of trying to control every narrative about you, you focus on living in a way that eventually makes false narratives collapse on their own. The third reason chosen ones are misunderstood is their refusal to blend automatically into group energy. Many social groups operate through shared habits and emotional rhythms. Conversations may revolve around gossip, complaints, drinking, or dramatic storytelling that reinforces a sense of belonging. Participation in these activities signals loyalty to the group's culture.
When someone participates enthusiastically, they are quickly accepted as part of the environment. Chosen ones, however, often remain present without fully joining those patterns. You may listen to conversations without contributing to gossip. You might attend social events without participating in behaviors that conflict with your personal values. Instead of amplifying negativity or drama, you remain calm and observant. While this behavior protects your alignment, it can also confuse the people around you. Group environments sometimes interpret non-participation as silent judgment.
If you do not laugh at certain jokes or repeat the same complaints as everyone else, others may assume you are evaluating them critically. They may think your quiet presence means you believe you are better than the group. In truth, you are simply maintaining your boundaries and protecting the energy required to stay aligned with your values. These three behaviors, refusing to perform, refusing to over-explain, and refusing to blend automatically, create a presence that many people do not immediately understand. The misunderstanding that follows is not always hostility. It is often confusion. People expect familiar social patterns, and when someone moves differently, they interpret that difference through the closest explanation they can find. Over time, however, something deeper begins revealing itself. The reactions people have toward you often say more about their internal struggles than about your behavior. And once that layer becomes visible, the true reason behind the misunderstanding starts to appear. As the chosen one continues moving through life with authenticity, selective communication, and strong personal boundaries, another deeper dynamic begins revealing itself. The misunderstanding you experience is not only about social differences or unfamiliar behavior. Often it happens because your presence quietly exposes things people would rather keep hidden. You may not be confronting anyone directly. You may not even be speaking very much at all. Yet simply existing in a room with clarity and discipline can cause reactions that seem far stronger than the situation would normally justify. This is where the next layer of misunderstanding appears: projection and the discomfort created by standards. The first part of this dynamic involves projection. Projection occurs when people assign intentions or qualities to someone else that actually reflect their own internal fears or insecurities. When someone encounters a person who is difficult to manipulate or read, their mind sometimes fills that uncertainty with assumptions. If they are used to environments where people compete for approval, they may assume you are doing the same thing quietly. If they struggle with pride themselves, they may interpret your confidence as arrogance. If they have a habit of manipulating conversations, they may assume your silence is hiding manipulation as well. In other words, people often project their own tendencies onto the person they cannot easily control or categorize. This process happens subconsciously most of the time. Few people consciously decide to misinterpret someone else. Instead, their mind attempts to protect its current worldview by explaining unfamiliar behavior in a way that fits existing expectations. When chosen ones operate outside those expectations, projection becomes a quick solution. It allows observers to maintain their assumptions without needing to examine their own behavior. That is why projection often feels strangely personal, even when you have done nothing directly to provoke it. The accusations people make may sound specific, but they frequently reveal more about the speaker than about you. The phrase, "projection is confession in disguise," captures this pattern well. When someone insists that you are proud, manipulative, or dishonest, despite having little evidence, they may actually be revealing the traits they are most familiar with in themselves or in their environment. Because chosen ones often remain calm rather than reacting defensively, this projection can continue for some time before it loses credibility. The second reason misunderstanding appears involves the presence of standards. Standards change the dynamics of any environment because they increase the cost of certain behaviors. When someone has strong boundaries, discipline, and clarity about their values, interactions around them begin shifting. Behaviors that once went unnoticed suddenly stand out more clearly. If someone attempts manipulation or disrespect, the presence of a person with strong boundaries makes that behavior harder to ignore. This is not because the chosen one is judging anyone.
It happens simply because the contrast becomes visible. A calm, disciplined presence highlights the difference between integrity and inconsistency without needing to say a single word. For individuals who are comfortable with growth and accountability, this contrast can feel motivating. They may observe your discipline and feel encouraged to improve their own habits. But for individuals who rely on weak dynamics to maintain control or comfort, the same contrast can feel threatening. Suddenly, the patterns they once relied on, gossip, manipulation, avoidance of responsibility, become more obvious when someone with different standards enters the environment. Instead of adjusting their behavior, some people respond by trying to reduce the influence of the person who makes them uncomfortable. One of the easiest ways to do that is through labeling. When someone calls you too serious, no fun, selfish, or difficult, they are often attempting to reframe your standards as the problem. By attaching negative labels to your behavior, they can justify continuing their existing habits without confronting the deeper issue. This labeling process does not usually succeed in the long term because behavior eventually reveals the truth. Over time, the person who is labeled difficult continues demonstrating consistency and reliability. Meanwhile, the behaviors that once seemed normal around them begin showing their consequences more clearly. But during the early stages of interaction, these labels can spread quickly because they simplify a complex situation into a convenient explanation. The chosen one eventually learns an important lesson about these reactions. Not everyone who misunderstands you is intentionally hostile.
Some are simply responding to the discomfort of encountering a different level of clarity than they are used to. Others are reacting to the exposure of patterns they were not ready to confront. Understanding this dynamic allows chosen ones to avoid another common trap, trying to correct every misunderstanding through explanation. When projection and threatened standards are involved, explanations rarely solve the problem. The narrative exists because it protects someone else's comfort, not because it accurately reflects your behavior. Instead of fighting every label, the chosen one allows time and consistency to reveal the truth. Over time, the same qualities that once triggered projection begin producing a very different reaction. People who observe long enough start noticing that the negative labels do not match the evidence of your behavior. In that moment begins the shift from misunderstanding to respect. As the chosen one continues walking through the season of being misunderstood, something subtle begins changing in the way people observe you. At first, the environment may still carry the early labels that were assigned to you. Some people continue repeating the same assumptions that were created during first impressions. But while those narratives circulate, another process quietly begins unfolding in the background. The people around you start watching. They may not say much about it at first, but observation becomes the turning point that eventually shifts misunderstanding into respect. The reason this shift takes time is because respect does not grow from first impressions. Respect grows from evidence. While misunderstanding is often based on quick emotional reactions or incomplete information, respect requires a longer period of observation. People need to see whether your behavior remains consistent when circumstances change. They watch how you respond when pressure appears. They observe how you treat others when there is nothing to gain.
And they pay attention to whether the qualities they once criticized remain stable over time. At the beginning of this process, many observers assume that your behavior is temporary. They may believe the calm discipline they see will eventually collapse under pressure. They might expect you to react emotionally when someone challenges you, or to abandon your boundaries when a situation becomes uncomfortable. These expectations come from their experience with people who rely on performance rather than genuine character. But as time passes, something unusual begins happening. The reactions they expected never appear. When someone attempts to provoke you, you remain steady. When rumors circulate, you do not rush into arguments to defend yourself. When situations become stressful, you respond with patience rather than panic.
Each of these moments becomes a small piece of evidence that contradicts the narrative people formed earlier. Gradually, the environment begins noticing the difference between what was said about you and what is actually visible in your behavior. This is what could be called the collapse of the narrative. Narratives survive only when evidence supports them. When someone is labeled arrogant but consistently behaves with humility, the label begins losing credibility. When someone is described as cold but continues showing reliability and integrity, the description stops matching reality. Over time, people realize that the earlier explanations they accepted no longer make sense. The gap between the story and the evidence becomes too large to ignore. This moment often surprises the chosen one because the shift happens quietly. You may not notice it immediately, but the same individuals who once questioned your intentions begin speaking differently when you are not present. Instead of repeating rumors, they start defending your character. Instead of interpreting your silence as arrogance, they begin describing it as wisdom.
Instead of seeing your discipline as intensity, they begin recognizing it as strength. The same traits that once triggered misunderstanding slowly become the foundation of your reputation. Results also play an important role in this transformation. While consistency shapes character, visible results confirm the effectiveness of your approach. Over time, people notice the stability you maintain in situations where others struggle. They see the progress you make through disciplined effort. Whether it appears as professional growth, emotional maturity, leadership, or personal transformation, the evidence becomes difficult to deny. When observers realize that your methods produce real outcomes, their perception shifts again. The behavior they once considered strange begins looking intentional. What they once mocked begins appearing wise. This moment explains a common phrase often heard in chosen one journeys. People do not respect what they do not understand until it works. When your path produces visible results, curiosity replaces skepticism. Individuals who once dismissed your approach begin asking questions. They want to know how you remained calm under pressure, how you maintained discipline when others gave up, and how you avoided the conflicts that consumed everyone else's energy. The change in their behavior becomes noticeable. Conversations that once carried criticism begin showing caution and curiosity. People become more careful with their words around you because they now recognize the value of your perspective. Some may even begin seeking your advice, guidance, or approval in situations where they once ignored your presence entirely. The transformation can feel ironic. The same qualities that once earned you labels like weird, too serious, or difficult eventually earn descriptions like wise, disciplined, or reliable. The difference is not that you changed your behavior to gain approval. The difference is that time allowed others to see the consistency behind your actions. For the chosen one, this stage brings an important lesson. Respect that grows slowly tends to last longer than approval that appears quickly. Because it was built through observation rather than performance, it reflects genuine recognition of your character. And once this shift begins happening, the final challenge appears. Learning how to move forward without shrinking during the season when misunderstanding still exists. As the chosen one finally begins understanding the full pattern, misunderstanding first, respect later, another important realization appears. The season of being misunderstood is not simply an unfortunate phase you must endure while waiting for approval. It is actually one of the most important stages of your development. During this period, your character is tested in ways that would never occur if everyone immediately understood and supported you. The temptation during this stage is often to shrink. When people misinterpret your silence, your discipline, or your boundaries, you may feel the urge to soften your standards just to make the tension disappear. You might consider explaining yourself repeatedly, changing your behavior to match group expectations, or participating in environments that conflict with your values, simply to avoid being labeled difficult. But chosen ones eventually realize that shrinking to satisfy misunderstanding comes at a cost. Each time you compromise your alignment for temporary acceptance, you weaken the very qualities that make your path meaningful. The misunderstood season teaches a different response. Instead of chasing the narrative people created about you, you learn to outgrow it. Narratives lose their power when the person they describe continues evolving beyond the limits of the story. If someone calls you too quiet, your consistent results eventually redefine that silence as focus. If someone labels you distant, your reliability eventually reveals that your boundaries were never about rejection, but about discipline. If someone claims you are difficult, your stability under pressure eventually demonstrates that your standards were protecting something valuable. The key to surviving this stage is consistency. Consistency allows time to reveal the truth that explanations cannot force people to accept. It means continuing to show integrity even when your motives are questioned. It means maintaining your boundaries even when they make certain people uncomfortable. And it means continuing to build your life quietly, rather than wasting energy fighting every rumor or criticism that appears along the way. Chosen ones also learn the importance of keeping receipts during this season, not in the sense of collecting evidence to use against others, but in the sense of remembering the lessons the process teaches you. Each misunderstanding reveals something about human behavior and about the environments where your energy truly belongs. You begin recognizing who listens before judging and who forms opinions without observing your actions. These observations become valuable guidance for the relationships you choose moving forward. Another important lesson from the misunderstood season is that you do not need the approval of the entire crowd to move forward successfully. Many chosen ones initially believe they must convince everyone around them that their intentions are good or that their decisions make sense. But over time, you discover that convincing the crowd is rarely necessary. What matters more is finding a small number of aligned people who recognize your character through observation rather than assumption. One or two individuals who understand your values can provide more meaningful support than a large group that only offers superficial approval. When you focus on alignment instead of popularity, your energy remains available for building the future that misunderstanding temporarily obscures. The chosen one eventually reaches a quiet declaration that becomes the foundation of this stage. You recognize that being understood by everyone is not required for living in alignment with your purpose. Some people will only understand your path after it produces visible results. Others may never fully understand it at all. Both outcomes are acceptable, as long as your decisions remain aligned with your values. From this perspective, the misunderstood season becomes less threatening. Instead of interpreting criticism as a signal that something is wrong, you see it as evidence that your life is operating outside the patterns people are accustomed to seeing. The discipline you maintain during this stage eventually becomes the introduction people receive when your results appear. In time, your consistency speaks louder than any explanation you could have offered earlier. This is why many chosen ones carry a simple internal affirmation during these moments. You do not need to be understood immediately in order to remain aligned. Your consistency will eventually introduce your character to those who observe long enough, and respect, when it finally arrives, will come not because you chased it, but because your actions made it impossible to ignore. If you're in the season where people misunderstand you, don't rush to shrink just to make others comfortable. Stay consistent. Time reveals character in ways explanations never can. Comment consistency if you're choosing alignment over approval. And subscribe for more Chosen One messages on discernment, separation, and elevation as your path continues unfolding.